You know, usually when we talk about a massive professional failure, there's this expectation of clinical precision.
Right, like engineering or something.
Exactly.
Right.
Like a bridge collapses, the investigation shows a fractured steel beam, and the inspector just points at it and says, there it is, bad materials.
It gives us a binary answer. It's clean, it's either broken or not broken, bad intent or just, bad execution.
And it's comforting, right? Because we really like things to be visible,
Mm.
but then you step into the world of high-stakes law enforcement, into the chaotic reality of a city street at like 2 a.m., and suddenly that tidy little inspection toolkit is completely useless.
Completely useless, yeah.
So welcome to this deep dive. If you're a learner who loves to look at the hidden systems running our world, today's text is going to fundamentally change how you watch the evening news.
It really will.
Our mission today is to unpack a really dense but honestly groundbreaking 2026 text by José Eduardo Macias Almanza. It's called Judgment in Chaos. And we're looking at law enforcement through a totally different lens today.
Yeah, we aren't looking at technical failures like an officer having bad aim or something, or even bad faith like corruption.
Right, we're looking at what the author calls an epistemological failure, which is a fancy way of saying a fundamental breakdown in how officers are taught to perceive reality before they even act.
Exactly. And our goal today is to impartially explore Macias Almanza's core thesis.
Yeah.
He argues that there is this massive, often fatal gap between rigid textbook protocols and the actual messy, chaotic reality of the street.
And that gap is what sets officers up for catastrophe.
Yeah. The text makes the case that structured critical thinking, not just, faster reflexes or more weapons, and definitely not more rigid rules, is really the only way out of this crisis.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand why the current mental framework for policing is failing, we first have to look at where it came from and why it was actually never meant for civilian streets in the first place.
Right. The author points a very bright spotlight on the warrior doctrine.
The warrior doctrine.
Yeah. For decades, police training in the U.S. and across a lot of the Anglophone world has incorporated principles developed by Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman. You might know his very famous books on killing and on combat.
Right. Those are huge in that space.
Massive.
Yeah.
But Macias Almanza's critique here is really nuanced. He emphasizes that Grossman's work is brilliant for soldiers.
Right, for actual military combat.
Exactly. His understanding of combat stress and the psychological resistance to taking a human life is rigorously researched. The problem isn't the military doctrine itself. The problem is the civilian context into which it was transplanted.
Without any adaptation.
Not at all.
It's like taking the programming of a Formula One race car and putting it into a yellow school bus.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
Right. Like the technology is amazing, it's absolute peak performance, but the environment is entirely wrong. You're going to crash at the first stop sign because you aren't on a closed track.
That analogy holds up perfectly, especially when you look at the three fundamental military premises Grossman's doctrine operates on. Premises that simply do not exist in civilian policing.
Okay, what are they?
First, in military combat, the enemy is identifiable and legally declared. Second, the rules of engagement generally favor neutralizing a threat when you're in doubt because survival of the unit is paramount.
Right, shoot first, basically.
Essentially, yeah. And third, the operator, the soldier, operates in an environment virtually free of civilian legal consequences for actions taken on a battlefield.
Well, yeah, but on a city street, literally none of those apply.
Exactly.
The person you're interacting with isn't a declared enemy. They're a civilian, a citizen. You can't just neutralize them because you feel unsure.
No, you definitely can't.
And an officer will absolutely face a prosecutor, a jury, cell phone cameras, and the public for their actions.
Which is why transplanting combat logic into civilian policing doesn't produce safer officers. According to the text, it produces officers with the wrong cognitive architecture entirely.
It literally wires their brains wrong for the job they're doing.
Yeah, and the author brings in heavily documented examples to prove this isn't just some, academic theory. He points to the tragic 2016 shooting of Philando Castile during a traffic stop.
Oh, wow. Yeah, a case that really shook the public consciousness. It's one of those moments that forced everyone to look at the actual mechanics of these encounters.
Right. And the text notes the specific training background of the officer involved, Geronimo Yanez. He had received 20 hours of what was billed as bulletproof warrior training.
20 hours?
20 hours. Compare that to his de-escalation training, which totaled exactly 2 hours.
Wait, hold on. 20 hours of warrior training to 2 hours of de-escalation.
Yeah, 10-to-1 ratio.
That's a staggering ratio. It tells you exactly what the system prioritizes,
It does. And it profoundly miswires how an officer reads a situation. That ratio directly led to the state of Minnesota legally banning warrior-style training in 2020.
Oh, they banned it entirely.
Yeah, the state defined it as training intended to increase an officer's willingness to use deadly force. Macias Almanza argues that this kind of training inherently increases the likelihood of lethal errors.
Because they're seeing threats everywhere.
Right. The officers aren't necessarily acting in malice. They're acting from the only cognitive architecture their training provided. They are programmed for a battlefield that doesn't exist.
But wait, I have to push back here for a second.
Sure.
Isn't risk just an objective fact? I mean, a weapon is a weapon, a sudden movement is a sudden movement. How can sitting in a classroom and taking warrior training literally change the physical reality of a scene an officer walks into?
What's fascinating here is how the author tackles that exact assumption. He introduces what he calls the ontology of risk.
The ontology of risk. Sounds very philosophical.
It does, but it's very practical. We naturally tend to think of risk as a fixed external object, like a physical tripwire in the woods. You see it, you step over it. But Macias Almanza argues that risk is actually a relationship. It's not just sitting there waiting to be found. It's constructed in real time by the officer based on fragmented clues, their own past experiences, their emotional baseline, and heavily by their training.
Okay, so let's ground this. Say an officer pulls someone over at night. The driver reaches toward the glove box.
Classic scenario.
Right. To an officer trained primarily in de-escalation, that movement is just a driver looking for their vehicle registration. But to a warrior-trained officer whose brain has been primed for 20 hours to expect hidden combatants,
Exactly.
that exact same physical movement is constructed as a reach for a firearm. The physical reality didn't change, but the constructed risk level is entirely different.
You've just described the core tragedy of modern policing according to the text. Risk isn't simply discovered, it's interpreted.
Wow, that makes so much sense.
Yeah, a gesture, a prolonged silence, a shadow in a car. These only gain meaning based on the mental framework the officer brings to the scenario.
Right.
Macias Almanza breaks this down into a taxonomy of risk, focusing on two distinct categories: the isolated symmetrical event, or IC, and the isolated asymmetrical event, or IAE.
Okay, an isolated symmetrical event, an IAE. That sounds like a literal gunfight. Symmetrical meaning both sides have lethal force and it's a direct clash.
Exactly. The text defines an IAE exactly like that, a classic life-or-death combat scenario, where the threat is lethal, immediate, and clear. It's a symmetrical fight for survival.
But an asymmetrical event, an IAE, I'm guessing that means the officer still has the upper hand? Like they have distance, cover, or time?
Spot on. An isolated asymmetrical event is entirely different. It's fluid and ambiguous. There's tension, maybe danger, but there's room for management because the officer retains leverage.
So they aren't forced to shoot right that second.
Right. They have time, they have options, they have distance to control the environment without defaulting to immediate lethal force.
So an IAE is a complex, high-stress situation, but it is fundamentally manageable. It's not a shootout.
And here's where the epistemological failure becomes deadly. Officers heavily conditioned by warrior training are fundamentally miswired to read the environment.
They read it wrong.
Yes. When they encounter an IAE, a fluid, manageable situation like a chaotic traffic stop or a mental health crisis, their brains misclassify it as an ISE.
Oh, I see.
They read a messy civilian encounter as a symmetrical, life-or-death combat event.
Because if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Exactly.
If your cognitive architecture is built for ambushes, every ambiguous movement looks like an ambush. They end up unintentionally escalating the danger because they're reacting to a reality they themselves incorrectly constructed.
And the really tragic part is they act with the full conviction that they are doing the right thing to survive. The system is functioning exactly as it was designed, but the design is entirely flawed for the civilian environment.
Man, so if an officer's brain is miswiring the risk, how does the legal system handle that mistake? It must offer some grace, right? I mean, it's chaos out there.
You would think so.
But according to the text, the rule books actually make it worse. Because the street scenario is constantly shifting, but these rule books are written in safe, quiet offices. They inevitably shatter when they hit reality.
Yeah, this raises an urgent question about how we judge split-second decisions. Macias Almanza spends a lot of time analyzing the gap between the norm, the written legal rule, and the tactic, which is
Yeah.
the messy reality of what actually happens on the street.
I mean, imagine you're at your job making a split-second decision on a chaotic Tuesday.
Right.
Everything is on fire, phones are ringing, you have maybe half the information you need, and you just have to make a call to keep things moving.
We all been there.
But your boss evaluates that decision on Friday, sitting in a quiet, air-conditioned room, sipping coffee, using information that only became available on Wednesday. That's the dynamic we're talking about here.
That is a brilliant analogy. The author calls that dynamic retrospective rationality.
Retrospective rationality.
Yeah, it's a massive cognitive asymmetry. The legal academy, police leadership, the media, they all dissect police action ex post. They analyze it after the fact, when all the information is complete, the consequences are known, and the physical danger is completely gone.
So from that cozy Friday perspective, every decision made in the Tuesday chaos looks like it could have been optimized, corrected, or easily avoided.
Exactly. And that retrospective analysis completely ignores what the text calls the solitude of judgment.
The solitude of judgment. What does he mean by that?
Well, an officer on patrol is usually alone, or maybe with one partner. They are operating with an extreme concentration of decisional responsibility.
Well, the pressure is just on them.
Right. They have to piece together fragmented perceptions in real time under massive physiological stress. The legal code doesn't provide an immediate actionable answer in that exact second.
Of course not. You can't flip through a law book while someone is yelling at you.
Exactly. The officer has to act to survive first, and only later try to map that raw action onto a pristine legal framework.
Which feels like a trap. When the system evaluates them using that clean, retrospective rationality, what happens to the psychology of the officers?
It creates a fundamentally unfair and damaging culture. The system essentially rewards formal obedience over actual survival.
How so?
Officers quickly learn that telling the messy human truth about how they made a terrified decision in the dark is legally dangerous. So they learn to act in the field under one set of informal survival rules, but then they write their reports using a completely different language.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they use a legally sanitized, discursive language designed specifically to justify their actions to that Friday boss.
So they're forced into cognitive simulation just to keep their jobs or stay out of prison. They have to pretend they were perfectly rational robots.
And the cost of this simulation is profound. Macias Almanza writes about the myth of the police hero.
The hero myth.
Right. Instead of acknowledging the immense moral and cognitive wear and tear placed on these human beings, asking them to make impossible choices in structural isolation, the system just leans on this lazy hero narrative. It demands that officers be cold, objective, and omniscient.
Which is biologically impossible. It completely denies the human dimensions of risk. Fear, ambiguity, adrenaline, time pressure.
Exactly. And when an officer inevitably fails to live up to that impossible, omniscient standard, the institution treats it as a personal moral failure.
Right. They say, oh, it's just a bad apple.
They fire the bad apple, or they add yet another subclause to the 500-page rulebook. Rather than admitting the conceptual framework itself is broken, we demand perfect outcomes from humans operating in structural chaos.
So what does this all mean? We've diagnosed a really severe illness here. We have the toxic mismatch of military doctrine, the fluid nature of how risk is constructed, and this impossible gap between the sterile rulebook and the bloody reality of the street.
It's a lot.
It is a lot. So if instinct is just a biological reflex, how does an officer actually train judgment so they aren't just reacting blindly? What is Macias Almanza's cure for this epistemological failure?
The cure is detailed in Chapter 9 of the text, and it's arguably the most operational part of his entire philosophy. He introduces a concept called minimum defensible traceability, or MDT.
Minimum defensible traceability. Okay, let's ground this. How does MDT actually work?
To really understand MDT, the text traces it back to the landmark 1968 Supreme Court case, Terry v. Ohio.
Okay.
In that case, a Cleveland detective named Martin McFadden observed 3 men pacing back and forth in front of a jewelry store. He didn't just arrest them on a gut feeling. The court established the standard of reasonable, articulable suspicion.
Meaning he had to explain exactly why he stopped them.
Exactly. An officer must be able to articulate exactly, factually, why they felt the stop or search was necessary. But Macias Almanza argues that for decades, the law demanded that standard without ever giving officers the operational training to actually meet it in the middle of chaos.
Oh, so they just said do this, but didn't teach them how.
Right. MDT is the operational tool to actually do it.
So MDT is the bridge between surviving the physical street and surviving the courtroom later. But how do you train it? What does an MDT training module actually look like?
It looks like rigorous simulation where the officer is forced to verbalize their environment. MDT is a mechanism that allows an officer to logically structure their reading
Mm-hmm.
of the chaos before they act.
Okay.
You put an officer in a training simulator, and instead of just waiting to draw their weapon, they have to actively catalog observable indicators out loud. They are identifying the specific variables that make their reading of the risk verifiable.
Meaning they can't just write a report later saying, I felt scared or he looks suspicious, which is entirely subjective and impossible to defend.
Exactly. Subjectivity gets you in trouble.
They are training their brain to say the subject bladed his stance, he dropped his hands to his waistband, and he ignored 3 distinct verbal commands. Based on those specific variables, I classified this as a potential threat.
It converts a purely internal, instinctive panic into a rationally verifiable action.
That's huge.
The goal of MDT is that any impartial observer, a jury, a prosecutor, a journalist, looking at the available record years later, could follow the officer's exact chain of logic. It makes the decision physically safe in the chaotic moment and legally verifiable on that calm Friday.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. The author says judgment acts as a buffer between stimulus and response. It's the pause. But how do you pause when someone might literally be pulling a weapon on you?
This is the unnegotiable premise of the entire book. You cannot invent judgment in the middle of chaos. Macias Almanza writes a phrase that really sticks. Thinking late is thinking poorly.
Thinking late is thinking poorly.
Right. If you try to consciously deliberate and build a legal defense in your head while a threat is rapidly unfolding, you will experience cognitive latency. You will freeze, and you will become a casualty.
So you have to do the thinking before the event ever happens. You have to build the architecture in advance.
Precisely. MDT must be built into an officer's mental architecture through thousands of repetitions long before they hit the street. It has to become an immediate recognition system, not a real-time philosophical exercise.
That makes total sense.
You train the reading of the scenario so extensively that when the chaos hits, the structured judgment is already there, ready to deploy automatically. It's about replacing panic and reaction with professional, defensible judgment.
This is a massive paradigm shift. I mean, we're talking about moving an entire entrenched institution away from a romanticized hero narrative and away from a purely reactive, fear-based warrior model.
Yeah, it's not a small ask.
Not at all. And moving toward a framework of structured, verifiable critical thinking. And the thing is, this isn't just about protecting police officers from unfair legal judgments or keeping them out of prison. It's fundamentally about protecting the citizens they interact with every single day.
Absolutely.
By giving officers the cognitive tools to accurately read an environment, to accurately recognize an asymmetrical event and de-escalate it rather than treating it like a war zone, you save civilian lives.
That's the ultimate takeaway. And just to be clear, Macias Almanza isn't trying to dismantle physical or tactical training. Officers still need to know how to protect themselves.
Of course.
He's saying that training the physical response is only half the equation. You have to train the reading that precedes the response. Without that, you're just heavily arming people, terrifying them with warrior rhetoric, and sending them into the dark.
It's a profound rethinking of how we handle human beings in high-stress environments. Macias Almanza shows us that when we demand perfect outcomes from humans operating in structural chaos, without giving them the cognitive tools to actually process that chaos, we are essentially training them to fail.
We really are.
And it makes you wonder, what other high-stakes areas of our society, from emergency medicine to corporate leadership to aviation, are operating under this exact same epistemological failure? Are we putting Formula One engines into school buses everywhere, wondering why they keep crashing?
That's a scary thought.
It is. Definitely something for you to chew on today. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.